given. We now turn to more evidence on the failure of the Seriti Commission, and for that I would please like to call Ms. Botsetsana Molebatsi, as well as Mr. Murray Hunter. Mr. Murray Hunter is from the Right2Know Campaign.
What's his first name? Murray.
Thanks very much for being here, Mr. Hunter. You are from Right2Know, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And you're here to help us in regard to the allegations that have been raised and the goings-on that took place in the Seriti Commission.
Yes.
Right? Thank you very much. We've heard in evidence before that the Commission found that there was nothing wrong with the arms deal in its conception, execution, or economic impact, and that corruption played no part in the arms deal. Your organization, Right2Know, was critical of the Seriti Commission during its sitting, and together with Corruption Watch, has launched a review of its findings. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Can you please tell us how Right2Know became involved in the Commission? And then, in addition, please spell out your organization's complaints.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you very much for having us. I would just say, in the interest of time, we have heard a great deal of information about the arms deal itself, and Botsetsana will speak about a lot of the procedural aspects of our failings of the Seriti Commission. And I think for me, I would like to speak to the human aspects and why an organization like ours is actually working to see justice done in the Commission, and why the Seriti Commission failed us. And I should also add that we're not necessarily experts on the substantive aspects of the deal. But quite simply, our organization was formed in 2010, primarily at that time to challenge the secrecy bill. We've since expanded to become an activist organization challenging secrecy and clamps down on freedom of expression across a wide range of aspects. But when we formed in 2010, although the arms deal itself had been signed off on more than a decade beforehand, that story in our history was very much alive for us. We felt that the secrecy bill as legislation was exactly geared towards covering up allegations of corruption in the arms deal and similar ones that would come following that. What I will say is that we believe very strongly that the arms deal, in addition to contributing to inequality and to poverty, had also contributed towards a democratic decline. That it had led to a poisoning of our politics, both in government, within parliament, and also within party political internal democracy. And it had led to conflict and factionalization of the security agencies that was spilling out into the rest of our politics and public life. So, in 2011, when the president announced the Commission of Inquiry into the arms deal, we knew that we wanted to be part of that commission. And in fact, Henny van Vuren at that time was an elected leader of Right2Know, and he himself in his individual capacity would be making a submission, but we said that this is also something that the Right2Know wants to follow. By 2013, we had, when the commission was actually beginning its hearings, we already had growing concerns. We'd seen a number of members of the commission had already resigned under circumstances that suggested they believed that there was a so-called second agenda of the commission. In following years, in fact, there would be further resignations from the commission. The civil society voices who were present there, which were led by the Lawyers for Human Rights and a number of individuals who have made testimony to the tribunal, they were trying to get information out of the commission and failing, and were essentially being shut out of the process as far as we could see. So at that time, we'd started to issue statements to the effect that we believed the commission would be effectively a whitewash if it didn't change its path. We published articles, we had information sessions for the public about the issues that we thought were at stake. And in fact, we published a website called Arms Deal Facts that listed a catalog of information that the commission either had refused to release or had dismissed, we believe wrongfully. For us, it was so important to bring attention to the public to what was unfolding there, because when we saw this very technical process unfolding in the Commission very slowly, the public was essentially absent from the proceedings, both physically and also metaphorically. If you were sitting at home, you wouldn't have known the Commission, you scarcely would have known the Commission was happening at all. There were a few journalists in the room who were trying to file these stories, but what we were seeing were these very dry, contextless pieces coming out in the media about, you know, a particular procurement detail, but it was lacking context. And also we believed was being shaped to some extent by a particular lobbyist who was in the room representing the arms companies, who was known to be engaging journalists on the sidelines and shaping the stories as they go. I would also say that the only week that we're aware of that there was actually televised hearings of the commissions was when President Becky gave testimony. Our personal interaction with the commission started in June 2014 when we, in fact during that same week, we tried to get access to the commission as members of the public and also tried to stage a picket outside the commission hearings, which the Tshwane police tried to stop, by the way. We had to go to court and were given a place 100 meters down the road to stand instead. It was a first-hand experience of how difficult it can be to be involved in a process like this and to raise an alarm bells about a process that was actually being governed by very powerful forces. We learned this fully when we tried to attend the commission in person at the Sammy Marks building in Pretoria, if you've never been there. We arrived with our green ID books and only those with ID books were allowed in. In fact, we were told by security that the ID books, those ID books would be photocopied and sent to the State Security Agency for security vetting. So in fact, we would have to come back 2 to 3 days later to see whether we'd been approved to enter. To our knowledge, this was a public process and nobody else had been required to make that, to make such an application. But when we did finally get inside, because we effectively insisted that we'd be allowed in on that day, we were not actually allowed into the room, but were given, we were put in a side room behind a panel of glass where you hear it through a sort of speakerphone. And in fact, just for those who weren't there, I've asked the tribunal staff to put up a slideshow that just gives you a diagram, because there is something very important metaphorically to understanding what the public process looked like. But perhaps not. So what we see here, it's very difficult to see, but what we see is effectively an empty conference room. Nobody can see anything. The first row of seats is made up of people wearing suits. There are many, many, many empty seats behind that. Now, if we can go to the first slide, please. On your far left is members of the evidence leaders. The next slide, please. In the middle, there's lawyers for several former cabinet ministers. On the far right, next slide, is the DTI representatives. Far right is lawyers for Fana Hlongwane, who was a middleman broker in the deal. Lawyers for the Department of Defense, and lawyers for Ferrostal, which was one of the arms companies that was there. In the middle, next slide, please. Excuse me, is Stephen Lauscher, who was a lobbyist who was representing the arms trade. As far as I know, he was the only member there who was effectively a member of the public and not a party to the commission. And then in the middle is lawyers for human rights and the legal team there. Very far at the back, behind the panel of glass, after many, many rows of empty seats, were members of the public who actually tried to get access. For us, this was a very physical representation of how close that process was. When in 2014, in late 2014, after many, many failed attempts to get information from the commission and to run a meaningful process, when the Lawyers for Human Rights attorneys withdrew, saying effectively that they no longer had faith in the process, we came out and supported them, because while they were facing a great deal of attack from the commission and from defenders of the deal, we believed that it was the right decision to make. And we were unsurprised 4 years after the process started, after many millions were spent, that this empty process had led to an empty conclusion, that there was no evidence of corruption within the deal. For us, this is, it's difficult to say that you were surprised yet unsurprised, but that was us. When the commission failed to acknowledge all of these documents and failed to ask these difficult questions, we couldn't trust that conclusion. And this is why Corruption Watch and the Right2Know Campaign have launched this review, which Basitsane will speak to. I think the one aspect that we want to add here is that throughout this process, we were forced to ask, what are commissions of inquiry for? Who do they serve and who do they shut out? Why is it necessary that we need to put our faith into a people's tribunal run entirely by members of the public? Because these processes have failed us. The arms deal has been shrouded in secrecy, and we can discuss that until the 12th day of the tribunal. But it has really meaningfully corrupted our politics. And the Commission has also violated our right to know, and it's violated our right to uncover the full truth of what happened in the arms deal. We've been robbed of an opportunity for accountability, and this is why we brought forward the case. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. There was a lobbyist that you referred to in your submissions. I wonder whether you might be able to enlighten us as to sort of a little bit more about the facts and details around how he was or she was shaping evidence and how you came to know about that.
Okay, so the gentleman's name is Stephen Laubscher. He was a member of the South African Communist Party, to my knowledge, in the pre-94 period, and became a journalist and worked for the Mail and Guardian and several other publications in the mid-90s. He did cover the arms deal as a journalist, and then sometime around the kind of the 2000 era, became a representative for one or several of the arms companies. I should also add, I haven't prepared testimony on this, so I'm going off of my memory from this crazy time.
Sorry to make you go off script.
But Mr. Laubscher is known amongst many members of the media, and in fact, part of what we were doing is trying to open up this process was we were doing our own lobbying of calling journalists and newsrooms to say, this process is unfolding in Pretoria, please put someone in that room. And as we were speaking to journalists, they're saying, oh no, Stephen Laubscher, I meet him, he meets, you know, we have these conversations over tea, and he's explaining to us effectively what's unfolding in the Commission. This is not to say there's anything, there's nothing necessarily wrong with what was happening there on the face of it. But what was happening is an effect of a very long scandal, which had effectively drawn out over many years where the newsrooms are very junior. It allowed these powerful interests to shape the stories for young journalists who haven't been around since the 1990s. And that has effectively shaped the narrative in the interests of the powerful players. Thank you.
I've just been informed and just need to check with you whether you would disagree that his surname is Laubscher. Is that, I'm sure if it's a mistake, it's a consequence of me taking you off script, but would you dispute that?
I hope that Mr. Laubscher, wherever he is, doesn't sue me for defamation. I did in fact mean Laubscher. Thank you.
Laubscher, okay. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hunter. Outside of that, we have no further questions for you at this stage. I understand that Ms. Molebatsi will be the witness who follows you, but speaks about the same topic.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. We note the words "at this stage" with some interest and hand over to the panel. But there's not. And then how is the panel going to clarify with this witness?
Thank you, Member Yacob. I did say at this stage what I had in mind, and I think that it was probably a bad idea, was that Mr. Hunter might come back after Mr. Molebatsi's evidence, but it would probably be a lot more expedient for...
So you're going to call this witness back for questions from the panel?
Well, I mean, the way that you say it, I agree. I'm skeptical myself, having just suggested it. I think that it would be better and more expedient to have the questions put to Mr. Hunter first, before Ms. Molebatsi comes in to discuss the legal aspects.
All right. Yeah, I think that might be better. Shall we go ahead? Yeah. No questions? That's all right.
Just a quick one from me. Thanks, Mary. So, just out of interest from me, noting your dissatisfaction with the findings and the process of the Seriti Commission, would you please describe to me how you saw this process unfolding and what the role of the public in that process should have been, and how that would have had a totally different result.
Thank you. So, I think what we saw, which is different, for instance, to commissions that ran concurrently, like the Marikana Commission and the Khayelitsha Policing Commission, was that, to some extent, it was topics and material that was inaccessible to the public. And people, the few voices who were in there, worked very hard to try to open it up. What we saw was a process where the commission did, in fact, seem to be very resistant to public engagement. And there were, I've mentioned several factors there. There was also the way that the commission spoke of its critics in the public domain, where it effectively set up an adversarial relationship between the commission and those who were perceived to be critics of the deal. To me, that even when the material is difficult, even when the material is asking people to go back 10 or 15 years into history, into a complex procurement, the commission could have invested so much more in making the public part of those proceedings, in the way that, for instance, we saw on the Khayelitsha Commission, to say that members of the public are actually the owners of this house, and the chairperson of the commission is there just to see that truth is done for them. We got a very different, our perception was that the chairperson was there to safeguard a process against members of the public. And that is one of the reasons that we feel that the public was failed by the commission.
Okay, thank you very much. Your evidence has been very educative and informative, so thank you. You were so clear that I have no questions.
Thanks very much.